to Leading Effective World Language Programs. My name is Mara Cobe, and I am glad to have you join me as we're going to explore a little bit about the principles of effective world language programs. So let me tell you just a little bit about myself and who I am. So as I said, my name is Mara Cobe. I am the district supervisor for Charlotte-Mecklenburg School for K-12 World Language Programs. That means that I get to work with all of the world language programs for 7 different languages. We have immersion in 5 of those languages. And I support 250 world language teachers for the non-immersion programs. And we are in the process of expanding our immersion programs as well. We have dual language as well as one-way programs, and so that's very exciting. I also represent a group called NADSFL, and I'll talk to you about that in just a few moments. And for those of you who don't know where Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools is located, I have a little bit of a map here. So I am in Charlotte, North Carolina, a little bit close to the South Carolina border. We are the 17th largest school district in the United States, and we are definitely a diverse group, represent nearly 200 home languages of the different students in our schools. We have 180 schools, over 110 of those are K-5. So you can imagine we are quite expansive, and we try to represent the diversity of our district with the offerings that we have, and we want to make sure that our students have access to high quality language programs. So the other group that I represent is NADSFL, that is the National Association of District Supervisors of Foreign Languages. And so that is a group of people who do what I do across the country. And NADSFL created this Principles of Effective World Language Programs document. We developed it back around 2014 and released it in 2015. It was designed to assist world language coordinators as well as districts and schools that don't have somebody who does that role. So for example, in North Carolina, there are well over 110 districts, as well as charter schools, independent schools, and so on. And of all of those various districts and charter schools and independent schools, there are only a handful of us who have a world language background. And yet there are world language programs in most districts and charter schools and independent schools. So it's helpful to have a guide that might give somebody sort of a roadmap of what are some ideas and guidelines of what would make a highly effective, ideal world language program. So I was one of the original writers, as well as Jen Carson from Virginia, Debbie Callahan-Diggle from Texas, Thomas Sauer, originally from Kentucky, who's now at the National Foreign Language Center in Maryland, and Alyssa Villarreal, who is in Tennessee. If you'd like to see the entire document, you may download it here at our nadsfl.org website. And so here is the link for you to be able to do that. So let's talk about why. Why is there a need to give a roadmap for district supervisors or for those who support or guide world language programming? Why do we need that? Let's think about it. A lot of administrators had a world language experience that might have left them with something like this.
Hola, señorita. ¿Cómo te llamas? Me llamo Mike. Me llamo Mike. ¿Dónde está el baño? Feliz cumpleaños. ¿Qué hora es? ¿Qué hora es? La 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 la. Me gusta la biblioteca. Vivo en la Casa Roja. Yo tengo 2 bicicletas. Muchas gracias y de nada. ¿Cuántos años tienes? Un momento, por favor. It's the one semester of Spanish love song.
Memorized phrases.
Mi mamá es bonita, mi gato es muy blanco. Perdóneme, perdóneme. La 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 la. 1, 2, 3 y 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. No remember how to say 11. Antonio Banderas, nachos grande y cinnamon twists. It's the one semester of Spanish love song. Au revoir.
So, as you can see, there are many people who may have had a world language experience where they memorized dialogues or they worked on verb conjugations, and that's the experience they had. Or you might have heard the conversation, well, I took 2 years of, fill in the blank language, and all I can remember is, or I, I took so many years of whatever, and I can conjugate a verb, but I don't know how to say anything. And we don't want our students, our current students, our future students, having those same world language learning experiences. And so we feel very strongly that we need to help administrators who had those type of language experiences make better decisions about the programming that they might have in their schools or districts. So,
Hola, señor.
let's talk about what's in the principles of effective world language programs. We divided it into 4 facets, these lovely jewel tone facets. So the first jewel that we would talk about, our amethyst here, is program design. So you have to know where you're going to be able to build the program. I work with a lot of immersion programs in my own district, and a lot of other districts may reach out to me with a lot of questions. We have a lot of parents who reach out. For example, you don't really want to start an immersion program or an elementary FLES program just to have it in K1 or K2 to say, oh, we started it in our elementary school, without understanding where you're going to take it by the end of middle school and by the end of high school. You have to understand, is this articulating into an IB program? Is this going to articulate into a Cambridge program? Is this going to articulate into AP? Are they going to work towards college dual credit courses? What is the goal? So program design is really important. Are there places where you anticipate that there will be study abroad opportunities? All of those things are important to consider. Well, once you have a pathway and you know where the end will be, then you want to start thinking about, well, what about curriculum? How are we going to get them there? If we know what the goal is, what is the pathway we're going to use to get them there? How are we going to teach literacy? Or how are we going to teach proficiency? How are we going to make sure that they develop that intercultural communicative competence? What is that curriculum going to look like? Are we going to develop it? Are we going to purchase it? Are we going to use a hybrid of both? What are those things going to consist of? Where will we find it? How will we vet it? All of those things are things that need to be considered. Of course, you may have goals of where you're taking the program, And then you may have decided what you're going to use to get them there, but how will you know that it's really being effective unless you are doing some sort of assessment along the way? You're going to need to do program assessment. You're going to want to assess whether your students are meeting those goals within a course, within a unit, within a program at certain important gateway years. All of those pieces are something to consider. And then, of course, all of this will fall apart if you are not focused on ensuring teacher effectiveness. So these are those 4 important facets of effective world language programs. So this document of principles talks about each of those. So when you talk about each of those different facets, each one will include the characteristics, again, of an ideal world language program and recommended leadership behaviors and suggested resources to build and sustain an effective world language program at the school or district level. So when we go back to program design, this is the principle behind the whole idea of program design. Effective world language programs cultivate globally competent students through the intentional development of learning pathways that will allow students to acquire linguistic and cultural competencies. So, for example, I used to know a school that had a really robust K-5 program. Fantastic. The students were developing wonderful competency, proficiency, cultural competency, language proficiency, and they would get to a certain level at the end of 5th grade, and they would go to middle school, and they would get off the train, and they would have an option to go and explore in different languages. And then a couple of years later, they would have the option of going back on the same train back to the language that they had studied so much in K-5, or maybe they'd go on a different language, but they would take a break and they would get off the train. And eventually they did some reflection and realized, well, if we start a pathway, we might want to give students the option of continuing on that deliberate pathway to keep developing the linguistic and cultural competencies that they've already built such a strong base for. And their program is now so much stronger than it was. It's beautiful. But that's the idea. You want to make sure that there's an end in mind and that that pathway is deliberate and intentional and continues. All right, so we talked about curriculum. Here is the principle behind that facet. Effective world language programs employ a standards-based curriculum that is based on thematic units with clearly defined proficiency targets and provides scaffolded language learning experiences and opportunities for students to interact with authentic sources. Well, there's a lot to unpack right there. So standards-based. So for us here in the United States, that would definitely be based on at least the ACTFL standards, looking at state standards that could be language as well as content standards. You want thematic units with clearly defined proficiency targets, and those proficiency targets, again, are usually defined by ACTFL and possibly by your state standards. You want scaffolded language learning experiences to help build proficiency over time. And you want to have opportunities for students to interact with authentic sources, not necessarily things that are created just for language learners where they only interact with the 5 or 10 words at a time that they've learned. It's the difference between, and I've seen several of my colleagues do this, the difference between only working with rubber duckies versus what, if they've only ever seen rubber duckies and they only play with rubber duckies, what happens when they actually experience a real live duck What is that going to do for them? How are they going to react? Will they recognize a real live duck if they're expecting what a rubber ducky looks like? All right, so assessment. This is the emerald as far as our jewels and the facets that we're looking at. Here's the principle behind assessment. Effective world language programs help cultivate globally competent students through performance-based assessment, evaluating how well students communicate in a variety of formative and summative performance tasks. A balanced assessment approach offers multiple ongoing formative assessment opportunities and feedback, and limited benchmark and final summative assessments. So lots of ongoing formative assessment, lots of feedback, and limited benchmark and final summative assessments. And that this should be done as performance-based assessments, and we're evaluating how well students communicate. This is different personally from how I was assessed, the type of language experiences I had. Mine was much more about memorize these vocabulary words, make sure that you conjugate all of these verbs, make sure you can put the correct form of the verb in the blank. And that's not performance-based. So we've moved away from that. We are focusing much more on performance-based assessments. And then the final jewel of our principles of effective world language programs, teacher effectiveness. Here is the principle behind the teacher effectiveness facet. Effective world language programs recognize that effective teachers are the most important factor contributing to student achievement. For world language teachers, the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning, or the TEL project, provides a framework, feedback tools, and resources for teacher-directed professional growth that is aligned with national teacher development standards and fully supports the World Readiness Standards for Language Learning. And if you have not seen the TEL project, you may check that out at telproject.org. I will tell you from the point of view as a world language supervisor, where I get to provide feedback to teachers and create professional development opportunities for teachers. I use the TEL project tools and framework for everything. I will use pieces from the framework to frame all professional development opportunities for my teachers. I use the feedback tools to provide feedback and to help with growth for our teachers, to help them set goals. And the resources that are there will help teachers who want to set their own goals. It's really a phenomenal suite of tools. Our state has even created an administrator feedback tool that takes our North Carolina educator evaluation tool and combines it with a full class observation tool from the TEL project and merges some of the language from the two so that non-world language administrators can actually use it to observe world language teachers, give them effective and valuable feedback and meaningful feedback within the framework and lens of how they are evaluated in North Carolina, like all other content area teachers. So, and we're not the only state that has come up with something similar. So once you dive into each facet and you get beyond the principle, you want to go ahead and you want to get down to these effective practices for each facet. So when you get to this, you want to talk about these. So for example, you would say the first one under program design. The school or the district has a vision that includes global competency, or curriculum in effective world language programs is aligned with clearly defined proficiency targets, or effective world language programs use assessment to leverage student motivation, or effective world language programs ensure that professional practice is driven by national teacher development standards, and so on. And so under each of these principles, you will then also see that there are program indicators. And these program indicators would be something to the effect of, there is a strategic plan to provide equity and access to effective world language instruction for all students. The entire school community supports world language instruction. The school or district builds stakeholder support for world language learning. Again, this is not a checklist. This is listing the ideal. So based on that facet of program design and the principle of the school or district has a vision that includes global competency, these are those indicators that would be the ideal. And then what would those leadership behaviors be for somebody like me or any other leader in that school or district to help move towards that ideal? Well, I contribute to the vision for global competency by advocating for language learning opportunities. I build community support for language learning as a path to global competency for all students. So for example, we are building a new immersion building, a new K-8 immersion building on the north end of our county. And there's been discussion about which languages are going to be included when that program opens. And it's not going to be able to house as many languages as it's another school that's on the south end of the county. So we have to make some decisions about which languages will be included. And there are a lot of factors going into that. And I, of course, am advocating for certain languages not to be excluded because of the opportunities that they might bring. So for example, I am advocating to make sure that we are keeping at least one of our Asian languages in that building because of the languages that are considered critical needs languages in the United States and in the state of North Carolina, and all of the opportunities associated with those for study abroad opportunities, for scholarship opportunities, for additional student learning opportunities during the summer that might be federally funded, teacher professional development, and things of that nature related to that particular language because of its status as a critical need language. So that's part of one of my leadership behaviors that I am taking as advocating for that opportunity. One other piece that is included in this document underneath those leadership behaviors, underneath each principle, is also a suggestion of items that you might ask a colleague to view, or something you might research online, or some searchable national publications like the NADSFL can-do statements or so on. So in this case, we're talking about, if I were to go back, we were talking about having a vision for language instruction for all students and supporting language instruction and articulated sequences and so on. And so things you might look for, so the suggested resources to look at would be examples of successful scheduling or guidelines for scheduling, or research and data supporting longer articulated sequences of language, or documents showing levels of language needed for certain types of jobs, and so on. So that's included in our principles document as far as suggestions. There aren't necessarily examples embedded in the document. I will say that if you are a member of our organization because you are a district supervisor, we do have a members-only repository of some examples that have been shared by our members. But at least the document itself will give you an idea of where to start looking or what to look for. So, how do you know if your program is a successful world language program? How do you know it's effective? Let's look at one example of what most likely would have been graduates of an effective world language program.
Tell us about the Accord.
Car and driver is 10 best.
How many times?
A record 26 times.
Interesting.
What about safety?
Overall 5-star safety rating.
Interesting.
It's perfect.
不要太过分，
我知道，可是我太喜欢了。
不要让他知道。
可是好漂亮。
让我解决，看我办事。So Brian, what kind of deal are we looking at here?
We have some really good offers going on right now.
Really?
Really.
Okay, we'll take it.
好极了，现在我开始准备文件。
Tell us about the Accord.
Car and driver is 10 best.
So, if our programs are successful and we are truly creating globally competent, multilingual, multicultural students, that's exactly what we would hope to have. Again, I thank you for taking the time to tune in with me and learn a little bit more about NADSFL's principle of effective world language programs. I hope you will check out our document. Again, you may find it on our website, which is nadsfl.org, and here is the full link to find it. Or you can just go to nadsfl.org and look up under resources, and right under resources, you'll find the drop-down will have principles of effective world language programs right there for you. Again, I am Mara Cobe. Here is my title. I am the K-12 World Languages Specialist for Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the United States of America. And this is my school email address. Here is my Twitter handle. I would love for you to follow me on Twitter if you are interested. And I have enjoyed spending some time with you. I hope you enjoy the first ever global C.R.E.D conference, and we are excited to have you here. Have a wonderful day.